delectable bliss and to finally crave food again. On the way to the table, I dragged my hunk of bread through the circle of salted olive oil I'd drizzled onto my plate, bit it hard, and swallowed it practically whole. Unlike Paul, who'd always been someone who eats to live, I had been, and now it seemed was on my way back to being, a happy fat person inside a genetically thin body, always anticipating my next meal, savoring it when it came. Today, I'd fixed Paul the other piece of salmon, lemon, olive oil, splash of tamari, and left it front and center in the fridge just so he'd know, when he got home, having long ago eaten the dinner his law firm had called in from some trendy restaurant nearby in the financial district, that I had thought of him, that I loved him. Elayna, the loving wife. I'd also left him a salad and a couple of wedges of a perfect blood orange. Placing my dish on the table, I uncorked the wine, poured a glass, and sat down. I ate in rapture, licking the plate at the end. Well, why not? I was alone, after all. My work lay open next to me, a manuscript of the latest soon-to-be issue of Popular Poetry magazine. Each month, the journal reproduced classic and some contemporary poems in a palatable and accessible form for those who wanted to see what they'd missed in college or who wanted a tiny, digestible version of the contemporary poetry scene. My job, bestowed on me by an old English major colleague at Barnard, was frankly a dream. I proofread and lightly edited the copy, not so much for mistakes or typos, thankfully there was someone else for that, but for content and appeal. In essence, I was simply an early reader who each month sent back a detailed critique. I made minimal suggestions, flip-flopped the two Hopkins poems, or more of an intro on the Dickinson might be nice, and sometimes I suggested stories. How about a feature on Edward Lear? The pay was laughable, of course. The job amounted to half-time work for an hourly salary barely above minimum wage, but Paul's hefty lawyer paychecks made that okay, and since he worked heftily to make those paychecks, it had been more important, once we'd had Hazel, for me to do something close to home than to pull in a decent salary. When Hazel was young, the job had provided me the perfect escape from the obsessive mothering and brutal self-examination full-time parenting can bring. Once Oliver died, the work kept me from descending into darkness when Hazel wasn't around. In fact, most of the time I'd looked forward to it, as much as I could look forward to anything then. But today, after my feast, for dessert I melted squares of the chocolate bar in the microwave and poured them over a fat ball of coffee ice cream. I was distracted, unable to focus. I glanced out between the little white curtains in my kitchen and saw a smattering of dark clouds moving in, trees blowing, swaying. Immediately I grew anxious. Hazel was phobic about storms, and I couldn't bear to think of her panicked out there. I glanced at the clock above the stove. Still almost 2 hours until I had to get her from Pansy's house, where she went on Wednesdays, half-days at her school, from noon until 3, more days in the summer or if I got busy. I got up, wandered into the living room, and glanced out the windows. This was the ugly side of our house, and the neighborhood canine porta-potty, a small strip of dead grass between house and sidewalk, overly shaded by a big old hemlock tree. Anything that did manage to grow there, the neighborhood dogs quickly dispensed with. I couldn't do much about their pissing, obviously, but the rest of what they did was illegal and infuriating when left there. Yesterday and today there had been fresh loads of poop to greet me, and looking out now, I spotted a third and felt the rage rise up through my blood, almost thrillingly. If I found out who was doing it, I'd tear the hair from his head. I wandered to the back door and then outside, onto the deck, and I leaned over the edge of the rail, letting the balmy breeze breathe over me. It was unseasonably warm. The air felt pregnant with pollen and humidity. I closed my eyes and shook my hair down over my bare arms, then inhaled deeply, sucking in the splendor through every pore. The cicadas shrieked. The atmosphere seemed to vibrate. I could feel the charge seeping through my skin, making me tingle with life. Life, at last. I could have wept with joy. Someone went by, walking a dog. I heard a collar jingle, loud panting, canine toenails on tar. And then I saw them, a silver Weimaraner with an orange sneaker in its mouth, leading a cute, crew-cut boy by the leash. Guy, not boy, I should say, though he was a boy compared to me. He was wearing jeans and no shirt, exposing his lightly freckled white chest. His arms were curved and ample for his otherwise lean frame. Maybe gay, I reasoned, but either way, a Gen Xer for sure, or was it Gen Yer these days? I watched boy and dog pass by, cross the street, and head into the driveway of the small apartment building Paul and I jokingly called the tenement. With its Victorian charm and 2 sugar maples out front, it was as unlike the tenement where we'd lived in New York, broken buzzers, roaches, filthy stairwell, as our tree-lined enclave of a New Jersey town was unlike Manhattan. Anyway, they mounted the steps, boy and dog, and climbed to the top floor, the 4th, dog still carrying the sneaker. In they went. I was surprised. I hadn't seen them before, and, ashamed as I am to admit it, I knew virtually everything about the area from my house to Hazel's school, and little these days about much of anything beyond. And certainly who'd moved into and out of the tenement. The place was filled with young people like him, not quite kids with tattoos and pierced noses, tongues, lips, ear cartilage, and yes, chins, hair of blue and green and nickel gray and magenta that stuck up with faux messiness. They were soon-to-be graduate students at the nearby university, or philosophically inclined slackers, artists, aspiring filmmakers, living off their parents till they figured out a bearable way to make a living, or invented some iPod facsimile and set themselves up for life. I loved the tenement. It reminded me that there were people in the world with obsessions other than their commute, or what preschool was best. These were people waiting for their lives to begin, people who, for all their manifestations of depression and grunge and loneliness, were secretly full of optimism and promise and the blazing, glorious arrogance of youth. Their mistakes didn't count, because their real lives hadn't yet begun. Things could change for them in an instant. I glanced up at the apartment boy and dog had gone into, but other than a couple of potted plants on the fire escape, there was no sign of life. Beyond the tenement, houses speckled the hills. If you climbed a hill at night, you could see a shimmering New York City, a million seductive points of light. I heard the commuter train wail, the cars on the main drag a few blocks away, streaming toward somewhere, maybe only the new mega Home Depot near the highway. I went down into the yard, set up Hazel's T-ball apparatus, and whacked the crap out of a dozen balls, high and hard. I gathered the balls and did it again, and then again. Then I turned and stomped back inside, panting as hard as that Weimaraner. I glanced impatiently around my kitchen, then took off my sandals and kicked them across the room. The floor, Italian tiles Paul had picked out on a business trip to Sicily, was cool and smooth on my feet. I peeled off my T-shirt and tossed that too, until I was down to the gray sports bra I'd chosen this morning, thinking maybe later I'd go for a run. My breasts were large and full, and not too badly sagging yet, despite having nursed Hazel for a year. They were still my best feature, and I'd always made a point of standing straight, shoulders back, so I didn't turn into one of those slender, large-chested women being dragged floorward by her rack. The rest of my body was thinner than usual. No exercise and little appetite for 2 years will do that to a person, but starting finally to bloom back into its curvier shape, and I was glad. In the living room, a Louis Armstrong CD was poised to play, but I wasn't in the mood. I tossed in Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill and turned up the volume. Her twangy, pissed-off rock blared out. I listened a minute, feeling it loosen me and make me happy, and then I did something I hadn't done since before I'd had Oliver. I danced. And, I kid you not, I sang, too, because the words seemed to be speaking to me, words about being tired but happy, sick but pretty, messed up but moving on. I twirled around, letting this sweet young thing's tough voice and angry words take